BookEnds Online Edition, produced by the Wadena County Historical Society and Travelin' Storyseller in collaboration with the New York Mills Regional Cultural Center. BookEnds is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Art and Cultural Heritage Fund. BookEnds programs from previous authors are now available on the website of the Wadena County Historical Society at www.wadenacountyhistory.org. Today's program will be available on the website shortly. This month's speaker is Peter Geye, author of Northernmost. Geye is also author of the award-winning novels Safe from the Sea, The Lighthouse Road, and Wintering, which was a winner of the Minnesota Book Award. He currently teaches the year-long novel writing project at the Loft Literary Center. Born and raised in Minneapolis, he continues to live there with his family. Next month's BookEnds on March 13th will be an interview with Mary Logue, author of Frozen Stiff. This month, of course, is featuring author Peter Geye. If you have questions for the author, feel free to enter them through the chat. Now let's welcome to BookEnds Online Edition, Peter Geye. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us today. It's not often that I'm grateful for COVID, but the thought of getting in a car and driving up there in this bitter weather, I admit I'm just fine sitting in my office at home. I think it's still about 8 degrees below zero down here in Minneapolis. And so even though this room, which you can tell from all the light, is like a little solarium, I still need a flannel shirt on and a long sleeve t-shirt under it. And I'm still chilly. That's how cold it is, which is maybe perfect for my books, and so much of them have to do with winter. My plan for the day, I'm going to just talk about my writing life and how I came to become a writer, and what the experience of writing these books has meant to me, and what I guess I hope they mean to readers. And I'll read a little bit from my most recent book, Northernmost. It just came out in, I guess it was in August. Time has no more meaning. Can't even keep track of what month when. I guess it's February. So it's been out for a few months, and it's a very strange thing, I must admit. I was just talking with a few of the participants right before we got started about the events that I did for Wintering, which was my book previous to Northernmost. And I visited like 130 bookstores and libraries and book festivals over the course of a couple of years. And for Northernmost, I haven't seen anyone's face in person, with respect to these sorts of gatherings. And it's very strange. No doubt that's true. And I understand that we're all doing our best, and that as responsible citizens, we're not gathering in large groups. But it's really given me a sort of pause. And I've thought a lot in preparation for days like this about what is the meaning of these gatherings. And when we get together to talk about books, what is it that I want to say? It's been my practice over the years just to sort of let the books speak for themselves, and I'll say a little bit about them and give a reading, and I'll still do that. But I find myself more and more inclined all the time to be reflective about my process, and reflective about the sort of path that I've taken to get to this place in my life, where I'm now the author of 4 books. I have a 5th finished that is searching for a publisher right now. And it's become, aside from my family, the central fact of my life. I'm a novelist, and a Minnesota novelist at that. And what does that mean? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, I guess you might call them reflections on that. And then, like I said, I'll give a short reading from the beginning of Northernmost before we open it up for questions. So I hope you have them. One thing that has remained true, regardless of whether we're meeting in person or online, is that as a novelist, most of my life is spent in this chair in the dark hours of early morning when everyone else is asleep, creating these lives. And the prospect of getting out among people and having a conversation about those works, hearing from readers, is really it remains one of the best parts of the whole experience. So I hope you won't be shy about asking questions about what you hear as I talk, or about the book, or any of the books if you've read them. That's what we're all here for, I think, is to have a conversation about that. So I was thinking this morning, as I was making notes for what we might talk about, where did this idea to become a novelist actually start? And I have a pretty direct spot that I can point to, and say that that's when I decided that I was going to be a writer. And I thought I'd tell that story a little bit because it feeds into the larger purpose of this conversation, which I'll get to in a moment. But I'm born and raised in Minneapolis. I live now within about 6 miles of, or 8 miles of where I've lived pretty much my entire life, with only a few years exceptions. And so it's a very familiar place to me. I went to high school at Minneapolis South High School, which is just about 3 miles from where I'm sitting right now. And at South, I grew up in North Minneapolis, but I went to South High School, and I was like a lot of kids, not the greatest student. I was way more interested in having fun and goofing off and being with my friends than I was in paying strict attention in class. And I had an English teacher, a guy by the name of Dave Benkin, who I loved, even though I wasn't one of his star students, far from it. I loved him and had just an enormous amount of respect for him, but not an enormous amount of respect for the material that he was doling out in class. And I can remember a day where we were in class, and I was sitting in the back corner, probably flirting with one of the girls I had a crush on. And he called on me, and I don't remember what the question was or what my answer was, but I remember his response to my question, which was, Peter, it's a lot easier to be a smartass if you've actually done the reading. You'll be funnier. You'll impress the girls more. He went on and on about why I might want to do the reading. And so I thought, well, if that's going to make me a better smartass, which was something I was very interested in being, I'm going to go ahead and do the reading. And I worked back then at a pizzeria in a place called River Place, an old sort of entertainment restaurant, movie theater kind of place in downtown Minneapolis. And I remember going to my job that day, and he had just handed out new books. So we were supposed to start reading A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. And I remember during a break at work, I flipped that book open and started reading it. And for the first time in my life, mind you, I was going into it just looking for jokes that I might be able to make about the assigned reading. But for the first time in my life, I was swept away by a story, and it happened right away. And I can't say why. I've read that book many times in the years since, and I'm always sort of searching for what it was that was so magnetic about the story and so magnetic about its pull on me. And I don't know exactly what the answer is, except that it gave me this feeling like the world was much larger than the one that I knew in North and South Minneapolis, that there were experiences and lives and things happening in the world all over the place. In that book, it's a World War I story. There's a terrific, sweeping, tragic love story in that book. There's a lot of story about Hemingway's experience as an ambulance driver in World War I. And I remember just getting to the end of that book and thinking, this feeling that I have of being so much more experienced in life or something like that is something that I want to do. And I decided during the course of reading that book that I wanted to become a writer. And it was literally it would have been in 1987. I was a junior in high school. And from that moment on, I started practicing becoming a writer. And what that meant for a really long time was that I was a reader. And I can sort of, as I wander my house, which is full of books, I can see different periods in my life based on the books that are collected together. And those early books that I read, books by, the sort of canonical writers like Hemingway and Willa Cather and F. Scott Fitzgerald and Eudora Welty and writers like that, I just piled them all one on top of the other and just started reading, and was moved over and over again by these stories. And there's too many of them to recount, but anyone who's had a lifetime of reading knows this feeling of getting swept up in a book and learning something new about the world, about yourself, about the people that you love, about the kind of person that you are, all of those things, which have become for me the most interesting parts of life. And certainly now that I'm a writer, a thing which incidentally was only true about 25 years after that decision in high school. I didn't publish my first book until I was 40 years old. So I guess it's 23 years, but that's a long apprenticeship. And though I did a lot of writing during that time, none of it very good, mind you, it was all in preparation for what it is that I do now, the books that I've written now. And I'm so grateful for it and still so mystified by the process and so sort of in awe when I read a terrific book or when I write a line that I think is good. Or when I finish one of my own books and realize that I've come as close as I can to capturing what it is that I want to describe about these characters' lives. And it's about that I'm going to talk a little bit. So I mentioned that first book was published when I was 40 years old. I'd spent about 10 years working on it. 10 years because of a couple of different things. One, I had no idea what sort of book it was that I wanted to write. I had no idea how to write that book. I went to 2 different graduate programs during the years of composing that book in an effort to understand just what in the world it was I was attempting to do. And when I got to the end of it and the book was published, it was a book called Safe from the Sea. And it was, of course, this great thrill. And I was so happy that this lifetime dream, a dream that I had spent more than 20 years working on, had come true. And it was so meaningful to realize, and it was a realization, it was not something that I anticipated, that now that the book was written and published and out in the world, I would be talking to readers about it and hearing from readers what I thought. And that sounds like such a novel and obvious thing, but it was not to me. I had spent so much time alone with this project that all of a sudden, it wasn't mine anymore. It was whatever the reader experienced in their process of reading the book and in their process of thinking about the book, if I was lucky enough to get their attention like that. And it really kind of floored me. It really kind of opened my eyes to something that I hadn't expected, that I had certainly never given any consideration. I hadn't thought about it. But it was also like the most beautiful thing in the world because it reminded me of when I was that kid in high school reading Hemingway and that feeling that I wanted to capture in whatever way that I could, I had. Or at least for some readers, they had experienced my book the way that I had experienced that book. Now, mind you, I'm not comparing myself to Hemingway. I wouldn't want to, and nor am I delusional about anything. But it remains true that experience, that transaction between my book, the story that I dreamed up, and the readers was one that meant something to some people. I'll never forget a reading that I did at the Plymouth, Minnesota library. It was one of the first readings that I did with that book. And a woman in the question and answer section raised her hand and she started talking about in Safe from the Sea, there's a father and a son who reconnect after many years of estrangement as the father is dying from cancer. And this woman talked to me about how her own father had died from cancer, and how her own father had shared so many similarities with the character in Safe from the Sea, this sort of stoic, reluctant, absent sort of father. And she broke down into tears, remembering her father as she talked about the book. Now, that's an exceptional situation. It doesn't often happen that someone breaks down in tears at a reading, but it was a reminder, and that sort of gave me that sort of jolt about what this process and what this project might look like. And one of the consequences of that realization was that I was thinking, thoughts like, oh, I have to do better at this. I have to be a better writer. I have to be more thoughtful. I have to tell better stories. I have to be smarter and more inventive. And I have to do put all this sort of pressure on myself to create a better product, a better story. And I remember in the time between when Safe from the Sea published and when I started writing the next book, there wasn't much time. So it's all kind of a blur. But I remember being very deliberate in a way that I hadn't been deliberate about Safe from the Sea, thinking about how I would write the next book, what it would be about, what the subjects were, and what the outline was going to be. I did not want to take another 10 years writing a second book, partly because it was so much fun to be a published author, but also because I felt this story really taking shape, and I really wanted to write it and get it out onto the page. And that book, a book that would become The Lighthouse Road, my second book, was originally going to be a very actually simple story about a woman who comes from Norway in the 1890s and settles in northern Minnesota. She goes there expecting to find her aunt and uncle, but as the reader learns over the course of that story, her aunt and uncle aren't there to meet her, and she has to sort of fend for herself. And what happens is she ends up working at a logging camp. And I had this story just really laid out, and I was all ready to tell it. I thought I knew everything that was going to happen. I had done all the research, a lot of which was terrifically fun. And I sat down with my pen and my notebook, which is still how I write, and wrote what I thought would be the first chapter, what indeed became the first chapter of that book, at the end of which she gives birth to a son in a terrific northern Minnesota snowstorm. And I remember, as vividly as I remember the experience of reading Hemingway for the first time, I remember getting to the end of that chapter and sitting there with this character and this child on her lap, this newborn child on her lap, and thinking, well, now you've got this kid in the story. And as I sat there sort of staring at this imaginary baby, I realized that he would grow up and have a life. And as I imagined that life, he would grow up and have children, and his children would have a life. And over the course of, I don't know what it was, maybe a month or two, this super compact and contained novel that I was going to write about a young woman coming from Norway was all of a sudden several generations of a family, literally several generations, the family tree for which shows up in the front of Northernmost. And there's that first character. There she is, actually. And her son is right underneath her. And so I had this sort of perplexing, but also terrific opportunity. That is, I had 7 generations of a family to write about. I had, like, spontaneously, I was imagining all sorts of things that might happen to them and the lives that they might lead. And I was overwhelmed. I felt like a kid with an unlimited budget in a candy store. I just didn't know what to pick and choose from. So I had to make some choices. And I had 2 options as I saw it. One was that I could take 10 years and write all 7 of those generations in one big, sweeping, epic novel. That sounded an awful lot to me like a 10-year project, like I say, which is one of the things that I didn't want to do. But it also sounded to me like a kind of like I felt the weight of all that at once. Not only because it would be so much work and so much more research and it would take such a long time, but because I would be responsible for so many people at one time. And I thought the other choice was that I could spread the story of these generations out over a few books, which is the choice that I made. And I made it for all sorts of reasons. The, you know, as a reaction to that weightiness being one, but also because I wanted to tell different kinds of stories. I wanted to tell stories that were connected, that novels that would be companions to each other, but not necessarily depend on one another from one to the next. Um, and I wanted to be able to explore in new and exciting ways the turns this family took from one generation to the next. And the prospect of multiple books gave me that choice. So the first of those was The Lighthouse Road, like I said, which is the story of that immigrant woman and her son as he grows up an orphan in the fictional town of Gunflint, Minnesota, which is up on the North Shore of Lake Superior and is loosely based on Grandma Ray, but is not actually Grandma Ray. At the end of that book, Ode, the child, is a teenager, and he's out on the ice fishing with his father. And that book then sort of served as a bridge into Wintering, which came out in 2016, and is the story of that boy, the son who's out ice fishing with his father and his son, and they go and spend in Wintering. They go and spend this sort of haunting and dangerous winter in the what we now know of as the Boundary Waters canoe area, but was then just in the process of becoming a protected wilderness. And it's also the story of his grandson, who is now a grown man himself, and in the 1990s, reflecting on what happened and what life is all about. And so, if the Lighthouse Road, which my aspirations for that it would be a sort of tragic, like a Shakespearean or Greek tragedy sort of book. And Wintering, I wanted to be this sort of cerebral adventure story of a father and son who get into some trouble in a place that I really love up there in the Boundary Waters, and what that might look like and what the ramifications of that might be. And all the while I was writing these books, in fact, ideas would pop into my head for the books that would come later. I would make connections between a character in one and what that character might be like 40 or 50 years later, or even the opposite, a character 40 or 50 years from now looking back on the experience of their life. And that became a real preoccupation for me as I contemplated how to round out this family's story. So I'll just say a few words about Northernmost, and then, like I said, I'll give a short reading, and we'll jump into a conversation from there. But I have another very specific feeling, memory about Northernmost, which was I knew that I wanted to tell the sort of bookends of this family's life. So I was going to go way, way back in time to the family in Norway and what the effects of sending their daughter to America might have been on the marriage between her parents, between these two characters. And then I wanted to come all the way to the present for a couple of reasons. One is I felt like I wanted the challenge of writing in the present. All of my books so far have been sort of historically based, or at least even the most current of them took place 20 years ago, which feels a little bit like history. And so I had these two very opposite ends of the spectrum. One storyline where there wouldn't have even been electricity necessarily, and one storyline where a husband and wife might talk to each other across the world on cell phones. And I had the feeling like that's an impossible story to write. I don't know how to braid those two stories together. I don't have the imagination to bring those two stories together. And I was terrified because my whole plan, which had evolved over the course of the 10 years of writing these 3 books, was like in jeopardy. How was I going to tell these stories if I couldn't bring them together? And so I spent a lot of time thinking about ways that they could come together, and a lot of time reflecting on what happens in a family 100 or 120 years earlier. What does that connection look like to the here and now? In my own family, there's a Norwegian immigration story. My grandmother came from Norway very young, but this was, part of our story, but not something that we spent a lot of time thinking about or hearing about. But it occurred to me that how much richer my life would be if I knew my grandmother's story better. I didn't have the chance. My grandmother passed away a long time ago. And my mother has also passed away. She would have had stories, but I never got those stories. And so it became an exercise in like trying to imagine these lives on, like I said, either end of a really long timeline, and how they would make meaning for each other. What would my life be like if I knew better the story of what happened? And that word story is one that kept occurring to me over and over again. And it's interesting to go back again to that first experience of reading Hemingway, how it was the story that really captivated me and really gave me that feeling that I wanted to describe. And so what is that feeling? I've thought a lot about it over the years. And for me, it's, as I've already sort of suggested, it's the process of falling into a story, as a reader, of falling into a story and feeling like the world that we actually inhabit, the world of 6 degrees below zero, the world of the bills piled up on our desk behind us, the world of the responsibilities that we have to ourselves and to our employers and to our children and our parents and all of that goes away. And what we have instead is the vicarious experience of the book that we're reading. And it can be any kind of book. For me, it's many different kinds of books, but it's that experience of being someone else for a while. And I realized a long time ago that I would always write about people unlike myself. But all of a sudden I had this feeling like, well, what if the contemporary story, if that character looked like you? And if you tried to inhabit a character like yourself. And so I made that character in Northernmost. Her name is Greta. I made her into a writer. I made her into a woman going through a divorce. I made her into a parent. I made her into this sort of this character who was at a crossroads in her life and was overwhelmed by the prospects, overwhelmed by the way her life had taken shape, which is very much how I felt. And though, of course, there are similarities like that, her story is its own unique story, but it became a new kind of exercise. And so if the Lighthouse Road was this Shakespearean tragedy, and if Wintering was a cerebral adventure story, then Northernmost was going to be a story about standing at the edge of a juncture in life and realizing that what's before you, what's ahead of you, and what's behind you is sort of bearing equal weight. And it was a really interesting and challenging perspective to write from. So and one I'm very thankful for, I might add. I think I learned more from writing Northernmost about myself than I ever could have known otherwise, even despite all those differences. So I thought what I would do is just read a couple pages from the opening of the book, where Greta, and this is sort of how I first imagined her, is standing on the North Shore, right outside of her house where she lives, and she's with her daughter. And maybe you'll get a little sense for how she's living in the world by virtue of this chapter. So it takes place in, I believe it's 2017. I can't even keep track of it anymore. So this is from Northernmost. Each night she leaves the light on in the front window and walks the cove shoreline out to the point, and from across the water tries to believe she lives there in the warm and quiet glow of the fish house. So many nights during the last year, the hardest of her life, after working all day on the house or at her desk, she's come out here to take comfort in the surging waves. My, how they keep coming. But for weeks, the cove and even the lake out beyond the point have been frozen. The cold tonight will make the ice stronger. The snow will make it softer. Her grandmother once painted the fish house from this vantage back in the 1940s when she was first a bride and still in love with the idea of living here. That painting, along with 5 others, hangs in the Historical Society on the Lighthouse Road. It's titled Fish House and Snow Squall. And from where she stands now, Greta can see it as she imagines her grandmother might have, even if she's standing in a blizzard, not a squall. The trees on the point sway in the gust, their blackness a shifting smudge against the snow-lit sky. "You're doing it again, Mom," Liv says, her voice pinched on the wind. Greta steps closer. "Doing what, love?" "Talking out loud." "I was thinking about my grandma." Greta brushes the snow from Liv's hat and sees its reflection in her daughter's eyes. "She was an artist. Her paintings are in the Historical Society. You've seen them." "The one at the fish house," Liv says. "That's the one I was thinking of." "It's not the same fish house anymore." Greta imagines some pride in her daughter's voice. "It certainly isn't." Together they look back across the cove, the wind biting their faces. Usually the radiance from town a half mile across the isthmus comes up over the trees, but tonight the snow blots even that out. The only thing alight in any direction is the window. "Axel!" Liv hollers as the dog chases a whirl of snow blown up off the ice. "Come here, boy." "He's okay," Greta said. "The snow's got him excited is all." Now they watch him bound off. Liv's crazy about him, a giant mutt that looks as much like a bear as a dog. At 2 years old, he weighs 130 pounds. His paws are as big as Liv's feet and perfect for the snow. "The wind's so quiet without the water," Liv says. Greta's heard that before and wonders whose expression it is, her mother or father, her grandfather. It can't be Franz, can it? "If it wasn't snowing, would the wind sound the same?" Liv asks. Greta puts her ear up to the night, as though listening for birdsong, and says, "I don't think so. If it weren't snowing, it would sound more like a scream. This is almost like someone whistling or humming." Axel comes barreling out of the darkness, storming into Liv's legs and knocking her down. She laughs and bounces up and tries to tackle him, but misses. Axel circles back, and Liv gets up again and pushes her hat up off her eyes, and together the two of them start toward the fish house. Greta watches them running, can hear Liv's laugh carried on the wind. Before they're halfway across the cove, the light in the window wavers, and on the ebb of another strong breeze, the house goes dark. In the closet off the mudroom, Greta finds the lantern and a box of wooden matches, and she lights up the mantle, and they go into what she's now calling the great room. A fire still smolders in the fireplace, and Greta rekindles it while Liv collapses on the leather chair. Axel shakes the snow from his coat and lies on the rug. The house is warm, but without power, the new bedrooms up in the loft will soon get cold. "We better sleep down here," Greta says. "Like a slumber party." "I'll go get blankets and pillows. You brush your teeth." Greta goes upstairs for Liv's bedding and the stuffed polar bear she's lately been sleeping with again. She grabs her own comforter and another pillow and heads back downstairs. It's so quiet inside. Only the snap of the fire and the dog's heavy sighs, and, out in the night, the wind through the darkness. Before she'd done all the work on the house, the wind had flowed through it like water through a fishnet. But with the new fireplace and chimney in the loft, with the new windows and roof, the place has been trued, and now the wind's kept outside. Greta arranges Liv's pillow and quilt on the big chair and spreads her comforter on the sofa. Liv comes out of the bathroom and jumps in the chair. "Will it stay warm enough with just the fire?" "I think so," Greta says. Liv reaches down for the dog. I can sleep on the floor with Axel if I get cold. He'd love that. Greta smiles at her daughter's easiness. She hadn't seen much of it recently. Liv's only 11 years old, 11 going on 18, what with all the mood swings and surliness, the back talk and pitting herself against the world, the unexplained tears and desperate hugs. Of course, Greta feels responsible for all of it. How many times each day does she agonize over Liv's mood? How much time does she spend wondering if her daughter will be all right? How much are her own choices going to cost her daughter? And her son, Lasse, too, who's staying the night up at his grandpa's house. I'll be up working for a while, Greta says. I'll keep the fire going. Maybe the power will come back on. Are you still writing the family story? Greta sits down and spreads Liv's quilt and kisses her forehead. I'm almost done. Is it a true story? Sort of. Are the people happy? Are you okay, Sweet Pea? Liv rubs her eyes and looks like she's about to sulk. Instead, she says, it's tomorrow we go home, right? And Dad will be there? That's right. We'll leave after breakfast. Dad's on his way home now. Liv yawns deeply, and when her eyes open again, they catch the light from the fire. I can't wait to see him. Oh, he's excited to see you, too. Why is he gone so much? Greta smooths Liv's hair. I think you should talk to him about that when you see him. Liv yawns again. I love you, kiddo, Greta says. Liv rolls on her side, facing the fire. I love you back. Greta gets up and takes the lantern off the coffee table and heads to her desk. She also built this. One day last fall, she'd gone up to a farm on County Road 7 to see about some old siding advertised on Craigslist. The unmoored barn had slipped from its foundation years earlier and seemed ready to collapse altogether. But the owner assured her it was safe to go inside, which they did. The same clapboard siding that covered the fish house was stacked in the haymow. It was a miracle, frankly, to have found it. She was about to start hauling boards out to her truck when she saw in another corner of the bar a workbench, the top of which was a chunk of white pine 4 inches thick and 30 square feet. When she asked about it, the man said, take everything. It'll be less to burn. Together, they loaded the wood onto the trailer behind her truck, and on a warm day in October, after the loft had been sided, she'd stood outside and sanded and planed and varnished the top of the workbench. She built new legs from cedar posts, and now it sat in the corner, up against the window. Greta looks around the fish house at everything else she's done. The loft bedrooms are the most notable addition, 3 small rooms up an open staircase, 1 each for her and the kids. There's the mudroom and closet beneath the staircase. She built the kitchen along the north wall on a small island where 4 bar stools sit under the counter. The wall facing the lake is all window, divided into 3 floor-to-ceiling panes. The floors throughout have been refinished and shine beautifully, especially against the fire and the hearth. The fireplace is her favorite part of the renovation. She and the kids pick the rocks from the river up by her father's house, and they cover a third of the wall opposite the kitchen. She had the hearth and flue installed, but did the stonework herself, straight up to the tip of the chimney. 2 solid weeks of backbreaking toil that had also been her best therapy. And I'll stop there. It goes on for another page and a half. And we see Greta getting down to the work that she is doing, which is writing a book, which is something like Northernmost. And she goes back and tells the story, learns the story through multiple sources and imagines the story of that first part of the Ide family who sent their daughter Thea to America in the 1890s. And so we get to go back and visit Norway in the 1890s as well. So I think I'll stop talking there and open it up for questions. Hopefully you have some. I'm excited to, like I said, have a conversation about anything really. So have at it. Please don't be shy.
Did you have the outline of the whole family when you started the first book, The Lighthouse, or did that come after you got started on that book?
It was my process, which I guess I sort of learned from writing these 3 books, in which I haven't been deliberate about in the past, but now I am more deliberate and more organized. My process is sort of to imagine what could happen, right? Like, here is this woman who gives birth to a son, and I knew that the woman, Thea, in the Lighthouse Road, was going to die soon after. So I knew that this child would be an orphan. And so right away, I started imagining what his life might be like. And as I did that, certain things took shape. He was going to be sort of raised by the town. This is who he was going to fall in love with. This is who was going to be his antagonist. This is what he was going to do for a living. All of those sorts of things. And as ideas come to me, I write them down. And it's sort of like, it's not an outline, a proper outline, but it is what I think of now as a catalog of scenes, as a catalog of possibilities. And so I was always building that. And there are scenes in Northernmost, including one of my favorite scenes, which I started writing when I was writing The Lighthouse Road. It's when her father, Thea's father, Ode Einer in Northernmost, is when his wife passes away. After years of not knowing where their daughter is, they get a letter that they think is from her, and it reignites his will to live, and he's going to go and sail to America himself. Totally ill-fated idea, but that the idea that he would do that is an idea that and it's one of the last scenes in Northernmost. That's an idea that was in a notebook from like 2011 or 2012. So for all those years, it's been sort of not every day, certainly, but it's been something that I think about and something that I would even write about from time to time, when an idea would strike me. So that goes into that catalog of scenes, which for these three books, it was like, which one is going to go where? It was almost like shuffling a deck of cards in a lot of ways, especially at the beginning of writing the different books, because while I'm in the process of figuring out what sort of voice I want to use, what sort of story I want to tell, there's a lot of room for playfulness and for experimenting. So no, I didn't have an outline. I didn't have the family tree. I knew what all the generations would look like. And I had a pretty good sense of what some of those lives might look like, but not a proper outline. Like I said, I've become more deliberate about this as the years go by. You can't see it because it's over on this book that I'm writing right now. I have these big storyboards that I put up there, and these cards that I just, anytime a scene occurs to me, I put it up there. And so I always have something to write. It's always, if I'm stuck on something else, I can just look over there and say, all right, on that chapter today, on that scene today. And that's about as close as I come to an outline. One other thing I'd say about that is that I understand a lot of writers do write from outline, and that makes perfect sense, of course. But one of the things that I find most exciting about what I do as a writer is very similar to what's most exciting as a reader, which is making those discoveries and the unexpected things that happen in a book that take you by surprise, that like make you reconsider everything that you've been reading so far in a good way. I love those experiences as the writer too. It's a big part of the fun. And I mean, I have a lot of fun writing anyway, but that's the dessert of writing, is making those discoveries. And when I'm beholden to the scene catalog or to whatever outline or timeline I'm working on, I find myself less willing to make those discoveries, make those inventions. So I'm usually pretty happy to flail around a little bit if I have to, if it means that there's eventually those other payoffs.
Cool. I see we have a question.
Yes. I just wanted to mention that as I started Northernmost, I also was starting a book that I received from my brother called Locked in Ice by Peter Geye. And it's about the Fram and Fritz Nansen. So when I started reading Northernmost and I saw the name Nansen, I just went, nah.
Yeah.
Can't be. And my question is, how much research did you do about the expeditions that the Norwegians did, or the Swedes, or the Russians, to find the North Pole?
Yeah.
And well, I mean, I know you weren't finding the North Pole, but so many of the scenes, especially with Ode when he's lost on the island after his partner gets killed, and he's trying to survive, and his love for his wife and his daughter keep him. I have to add that Ode was just such a sweet man. I fell in love with him. He was just a sweetheart. Harry was a little rough around the edges. And Thea's Ode was a very sweet man too, but the original Ode had a heart of gold.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so glad you asked that question. I took my glasses off and was looking across the room because I have the same book. I have lots and lots of books about
Bet you do.
exploration. I don't see it from where I'm sitting, so I must have taken it and set it somewhere else. But it's a really good question. So one of the things that these ideas don't exist in a vacuum, right? They're not. There's a world surrounding the family life of these characters. And I'm always looking for ways to bring that world into this story. And one of the ways that I did that with Northernmost is in thinking about the time and in thinking about what was happening in the world and what would have been significant to these people in the world. Certainly Nansen's first voyage aboard the Fram would have been front of mind. For those of you who don't know, we're talking about Fridtjof Nansen, who was a great polar explorer and eventually a Nobel Prize winning humanitarian, who in the years get muddled in my head, but in like 1895 or 6, set about expedition to the North Pole, attempting to find the North Pole. And his plan was that he had a special ship built called the Fram, that he would sail around the bottom of the Arctic Circle to a point over Siberia. He would then get set in ice. The ship, which was specially built, would get set in ice. And then that ice would just flow up over the North Pole. And it was an idea that was roundly at the time thought preposterous and ridiculous. Like, this is the worst idea that any polar explorer has ever had. And though he didn't reach the North Pole on that expedition, he did get farther north than any person had ever got before. I forget what the degrees were, but he was within a couple of degrees, I think, of actually getting to the North Pole. And he was, of course, lauded as a hero. The story of his adventure on the Fram, and eventually he and one man get off of the Fram and attempt to go on foot to the rest of the way to the North Pole. It's a riveting story, and I've known that story for a long, long time because I have a fascination with polar and Arctic exploration, and I just love it. And it happens to be true that he ended up on his return in the town of Hammerfest, which is the town that I accidentally or serendipitously chose that these people would be from, that this family would be from in Norway. At exactly about the time that it would have been conducive to telling his story, or the story of Nansen, in the context of this family, which I do. One of the reason Ode Einar and Northernmost ends up in the Arctic is because Otto Sverdrup, who was first mate and eventually captain of the Fram, came up to him on the wharf and said, "How would you like a job?" And he ends up working on a boat that goes north. So all of the machinations of that. I mean, I can't tell you how exciting it was for me. I know it sounds pretty nerdy, but it was I just love that stuff. And it all just aligned perfectly and gave me a reason to get Ode Einar up into the Arctic, which is something that I wanted to do. And I don't know why I wanted to do it. The fact that I made Greta's husband, a man named Franz, a descendant of Nansen. I mean, I went into the genealogy of the Nansen family. I know the names of all of his ancestors through the years. And it just became this thing to play with and to sort of shape into something that might look like a realistic story. And that's what I mean about the world outside of the family coming to bear on this story. Like there's a book that I have of a sort of history of the town of Hammerfest, Norway, and there's a picture of Nansen standing there in front of the full town band with bunting all over the place. His heroes welcome back from this expedition, which happens on the same street that the character that I invented, well before I ever knew that was true of Nansen, lived. So that kind of serendipity is just, it's the stuff that we dream about as writers, especially if we're as geeked out about the material as I am about Nansen and the other polar explorers. The last thing I would say about that is as I was making all of these connections, and this is something that would have happened in 2016, 2017, as I was really getting down to the business of writing Northernmost, I realized that I really had to go to these places. I had to go to Hammerfest, and I had to go to Svalbard, Spitsbergen in the book, which is what it was known then, this Arctic island. And I didn't exactly know why, but I just wanted to stand there and breathe the air and feel what these characters would have felt. And so I did that. And for the longest time, I had this vision that the opening scene of Ode Einar, or of Greta's story, would be in the Hammerfest cemetery. And when I went to Hammerfest with my wife, the first place that we went after we checked in was to the cemetery. I mean, it's a very small town. It's like, imagine, I don't know, maybe 10,000 people live there, and it's all, you could walk from one end of it to the other in 5 minutes. It's pretty small. But it's right in the middle of town, right next to the big, beautiful church, which is the landmark and the town landmark. And so we went in, and I was just wandering the graves, this place that I had been in my imagination like 1,000 times. And there on two headstones side by side, there was one man named Ode Einar, and I forget what his last name is. I have a picture of it, but Ode Einar something, totally unrelated. The next gravestone over the family name was Ide. And this is, 10 years after writing the names down on a family tree. It's amazing the serendipity of all of that. And I took it to mean that I had, good instincts or lucky instincts or something, some way or another. It all just aligned in the same way that Nansen, having actually been there, would have aligned perfectly with the story of Ode Einar and his wife Inger. So, yeah.
Thank you. I do have another question.
Sure.
This is very different, and maybe you don't even want to go there, but I noticed, remember the Oz family? They really start back when young Ode, Thea's Ode, is around, and they're kind of a competitor. And then there's the Ide family, and I saw them as representations of capitalism versus individualism. And I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but I kept in Wintering, Oz is a pretty evil, wicked guy. And I'm just thinking, what does he represent? I mean, there's a lot of mean people, but what does he in the whole represent? And that's what I came up with, just greed, trying to just take everything, and not looking out for other people. Where is the Ide family throughout their generations were pretty community minded in terms of helping each other, not taking from each other.
I don't think I thought of it in terms of like capitalism and, you know, whatever the opposite of capitalism is. I thought of it in terms of decency and in terms of respectfulness, and in terms of like almost like honest living versus dishonest living or something like that. And of course, there are all sorts of shades of ambiguity about this. But it really was as simple as that. The Oz family in Wintering is they are the antagonists. They're the folks who make the selfish, sometimes really horrific decisions that set some of the action in motion, and that Ode and Harry, or that Harry and Gus, excuse me, have to respond to, and have to react to. So they're a force on the story, like narratively, they're a force on the story, and there's that element of them. But there's also just this notion that I have. And it gets more and more complicated the older I get, but that there are some people who are really decent in this life and some people who are not. And oftentimes those people sit across the table from each other and have to resolve their differences. It's not usually as dramatic as the resolving of differences in Wintering, which is pretty dramatic. Mm-hmm. But it is true that their forces coming to a head. And I love that mode of storytelling. You know, it doesn't have to be two people against each other. It can be an idea, or it can be a landscape, or it can be politics, or it can be any number of things where forces come to a head. But it's in those moments of coming to a head where and in the building up of coming to that head where so much drama can happen. And Charlie Oss is just plain evil. I mean, he's an evil man. And I usually try to be a little bit more ambiguous about who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. In the Lighthouse Road, there's a character named Hosea Grimm, whose whole function was for me to be a source of moral ambiguity. Charlie Oss is not morally ambiguous. He's rotten to the core. Yeah.
I found Hosea to be very complicated.
Well, Hosea is making a comeback. He's in the book that I'm working on now.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
I hope so.
I didn't know if to love him or hate him. I mean, when he was doing the removing Thea's ovaries, I thought, what? Did he really think he was doing her a favor? Or I have to believe he thought he was doing her a favor.
Yep. Yep.
And I don't know much about his background. Like, is he Norwegian? Is he German? Is he?
Stay tuned.
Okay. Thank you.
There's more coming. Yes. Okay. The book that I'm just starting to write now. So it'll be a little while, but he remains for me full of questions, and has sort of, I don't know, I wouldn't say haunted, but he's been on my mind a lot over the years because as I think about him and think about what I learned from him, which is one of the standards that I have for characters, the answers are not always clear. And I'm excited to get a little closer to some clarity about that.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed all three books, and I haven't read The Seas, Safe from the Seas, but I'll probably get to that this year. And I look forward to other books. Love reading Minnesota writers. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That's kind of you to say. So I don't know if anyone else has any questions. We're getting pretty close to wrapping up, but there's probably time for one more if anyone has one.
Okay, I'm Sandy. I'm coming late to the table, so to speak. I just discovered you as an author a couple months ago, and I've read your first two books. And in the Lighthouse Road, and now I know you've continued and that Ode and Harry got off the ice. But when I read that last chapter of your book, just how you wrote it, it was like, is this supposed to kind of be a cliffhanger? Are they going to get off the ice safely or aren't they? Did you intentionally write it that way?
Oh, very much intentionally, yes. And in fact, more than intentionally, I mean, super deliberately. It was meant, as I said, I think earlier, to be a bridge to the next book. And Wintering, the book that comes after the Lighthouse Road, ends in the very same spot,
Okay.
where what happens at the end of the Lighthouse Road, the rest of that scene plays out at the end of Wintering. And I won't tell you what happened.
Okay.
But it's a big part of the Ide family lore, and a big part of sort of what sets their family's life in motion. I mean, there are a couple of big events like that. And I couldn't help noticing, I don't know if anyone was watching the news, I guess it was probably earlier this week, about the ice fishermen in Duluth who were ice fishing right outside of Duluth Harbor, and the ice detached, and they had to be rescued as their fishing gear floated up an ice floe up the North Shore. Was reminded again of Harry and Ode out there on the ice.
Okay. Have you done your own genealogy? I was thinking when you said you went and you saw the graves next to each other and how it all just kind of worked out in retrospect. It's like, well, if you knew your own genealogy, could you possibly be related to any of these people, and somewhere in your genetic memory is where these things come from?
That I love that term, my genetic memory. I have not done my own genealogy. I know that we're certainly not related. My Norwegian ancestors are from an entirely different part of Norway. Norway is a huge, long country, and the Ides in Northernmost and in the Lighthouse Road are from this town, Hammerfest, which is the northernmost town in the world. That's what they're known as. Way, 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 way at the top of Norway, almost to Russia. And so they're not. I do know a little bit about it because I had my own genealogy, because I had a cousin that did a lot of that work. So I have some sense of it, but I don't. And I often wonder, like, why don't you? You should. It would be interesting to know all these things about your family. There's another part of me that thinks the genealogy that I've done for the Ides feels adequate in a way. Which is a very strange thing to say, because it's of course totally made up and fictional, but it also seems sort of true that that's the case, that it satisfies for me at least what I might get from doing my own genealogy.
Yeah, it always sort of fascinates me because I was adopted and I even did DNA, but all I get back are like 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th cousins unrelated to each other, and I'm like, none of them look like me, so it's not very helpful. So I always find it fascinating how people can like trace their families and see where they came from.
Yeah, there's a part of me, I guess, that is really happy being who I am, and the family that I mean, I have a big immediate family. I have 4 brothers and sisters, and we're all very close and love each other, and it's super healthy. And beyond that, my family is not very big. My mom only had 1 sibling. My dad had 2 siblings, only one of whom had kids. So I don't have a bunch of cousins. I don't have a bunch of aunts and uncles. And I'm afraid that whatever discoveries I might make might corrupt the sense of family that I do have, or something like that. I don't know if that's true. And maybe when I have more time someday, I'll look into it. But I haven't had the inclination to do it so far. Not that I haven't thought about it, but well, thank you all so much for joining me today. I hope you stay warm, stare into the sun and pretend like you're on a beach somewhere. And thank you all for joining me today. It was really lovely to talk to you, and I thank you for making conversation. Yeah.